What is the probability that Russia attacks Ukraine with a tactical nuclear weapon?
Well, Putin's definitely been thinking about it, right? I mean, he is the kind of person, if he's got an instrument, he wants to figure out how to use it. We look at polonium, we look at Novichok, we look at all kinds of things, that he's also presided over in Syria. He has, put in charge of the war in Ukraine now. General Severikin is known as General Armageddon, the kind of person who, pretty much facilitated the use of chemical weapons in Syria, for example. So, don't think that Putin, hasn't thought about how ruthless he can possibly be. The question is really the calculation. It's his estimation of the probability that it will get the desired effect. We keep talking about this idea of escalate to de-escalate. That's not what the Russians, how they call it, but it's the whole idea that you do something really outrageous to get everybody else to back off. Yeah. Now, when you talked about the precedent that the United States set of detonating the nuclear weapons in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, he obviously meant the precedent of using nuclear weapons, of course, which, of course, we would then say, well, we showed then how the impermissibility of ever doing that again. But what he's talking about is the precedent of escalating to such an extent that you stop the war, because he reads that saying, well, the US dropped the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the war was brought to a quick conclusion. And of course, there's a huge debate in America about whether it was necessary to do that, whether the war was ending anyway. Did that really, change the minds of the Japanese high command? I mean, there's all kind of books and being written about that. And of course, the revulsion that people felt in the wake of that was just the shock of what actually happened. And we've spent, 70 years, basically coming to terms with the fact that we did something like that. The firebombing, we've also looked at all the bombing, in Vietnam and everywhere. And, all these massive bombing campaigns, and realizing they actually often had the opposite effect. Hiroshima and Nagasaki might have contributed, and there's a lot of scholarship suggesting it did to the end of the war. But a lot of the big bombing campaigns, the destruction, actually prolonged wars because they made people fight back, as we're kind of seeing in the case of Ukraine. So Putin has to calculate the probability that if he uses some tactical nuclear weapon, that it'll get the desired effect, which is get us to capitulate and Ukraine to capitulate. Us to capitulate, meaning the United States and the Europeans not supporting Ukraine anymore, pushing towards the negotiating table and negotiating Ukraine away, and Ukraine saying, okay, we give up, like happened in Hiroshima and Nagasaki or in Japan. So it's his calculation, as much as anything else, which is really important. He said, we have to show him that he won't get that out of it. It's kind of less our probability and, kind of the odds of it. It's just how he calculates that probability of getting what he wants.
I mean, I guess that's how the game of poker works. It's your probability and your estimate of their probability and your estimate of their estimate of your probability, and so on and so
it
forth.
goes on. Yeah, exactly.
I think he has two tools, right? So one is the actual use of nuclear weapons, and then the threat of the
the threat is very effective.
And the more real you make the threat.
That's right.
So it's like the more you approach the actual use, like get very close to using
he's already using Chernobyl, Zaporizhia, and then Yuzhno-Ukrainsk, the other nuclear reactor. So he's using civilian nuclear reactors as a dirty bomb. So, it's ironic that he has Sergei Shoigu, his defense minister, calling people up and saying the Ukrainians are going to use a dirty bomb. They're already doing it. I mean, what is, kind of more destructive than stirring up all the radioactive dust in Chernobyl as you send your troops through, for example, or shelling, the Chernobyl plant and the sarcophagus and putting it at risk. And Zaporizhia, you've got the International Atomic Energy Agency running out there in utter panic and, kind of also trying to intervene in the conflict. So you're putting, civilian nuclear reactors at risk. I mean, that also has the great added effect of cutting off Ukraine's power supply, because Zaporizhia in particular was a third of Ukraine's power generation, or some, really high percentage. I'd have to go back and, take a look at that. But that's a twofer. It's a kind of a double effect there of undermining power generation, also frightening Germans and others who've already been very worried about nuclear power and, increasing a leverage on the energy front, but also scaring people from the perspective of the use of nuclear weapon. Those reactors also become a nuclear weapon tactically deployed. And as you said, the discussion of using a nuclear weapon and engendering all those fears. And he's already got an effect. Everyone's running around talking about the Cuban Missile Crisis and secret diplomacy and how we negotiate away Ukraine in return for Putin not blowing up a nuclear weapon. So he's got a lot of people already talking about that.
So sorry for the difficult and dark question. It could be for you directly or more like, do you think we have a plan for this? What happens if he does drop a nuclear weapon? Do you have a sense that the United States has a good plan?
I know we're talking about it. I think we probably have several plans because it depends on what, where, when, how.
But don't these things happen very quickly?
Well, there's also signaling and signs of movement there. I mean, I want to be very, kind of careful about this. But the thing is, it's also very important that we do this with other nuclear powers. So look, the other thing that's different from how it might have been in the past, and particularly different from the Cuban Missile Crisis and the Iran Missile Crisis, we're not the only nuclear players. China, has a major nuclear arsenal now, less on the strategic side, but building it up, but very much on the intermediate range and tactical. Kim Jong-un is firing off weapons left, right, and center at the moment in North Korea. We've got other rogue states. Putin's behaving like a rogue state, just to be very clear here. And this is what we've got with Kim Jong-un in North Korea. We've also got India and Pakistan. And we've got other states that we're not supposed to talk about that we know have nuclear capacities and others that would like to have nuclear capacity. And the whole question here is about also proliferation. Getting back to that time when Ukraine had nuclear weapons, at least there on its territory in sort of Belarus and Kazakhstan, you've got to wonder, was it wise for them to give it up? We were worried about, kind of loose nukes, nuclear weapons, kind of getting out of hand, proliferation at the time. We wanted fewer nuclear powers. Russia wanted that too. Now we're going to have more. We've got more. And what Putin is saying is, well, that was stupid of Ukraine to give up the nuclear weapons. In fact, my colleagues and I, back in our report and back in the USSR, kind of suggest they shouldn't give them up. And then that's why we had the Budapest Memorandum. That's why the United States and the United Kingdom in particular have, basically some responsibility and obligation going back to 1994 when they promised Ukraine that gave up the nuclear weapons, their territorial integrity and sovereignty would remain intact, some obligation to actually do something to step up. If we step back from that, this is the thing that people are not talking about. What about nuclear proliferation? If you're South Korea, you're Japan, you're any other country that's kind of worrying about your neighbors and, what might happen to you. And just like India and Pakistan are both like, whoa, we've got to kind of keep our strategic nuclear balance here. Everything is up for question. Saudis will want a nuclear weapon. The Turks already want one. They've talked about one for years. Why should the Iranians be the only one with an Islamic nuclear weapon? And if we know that, Iran has breakout capacity now, the Saudis and all the other, states that are in opposition to Iran will also want to have some nuclear capacity. And the United States before wanted to maintain everything under the nuclear umbrella. One of the reasons why Sweden and Finland are joining NATO is because of suddenly all of these nuclear threats. Sweden was actually the last country on the planet to want to have nuclear weapons. They were actually pushing for a ban on nuclear weapons at the United Nations. Now that Putin's doing the nuclear saber rattling, they're talking about joining and are on the verge of joining a nuclear alliance. Mm-hmm. See what's happening here. So we have to make it more and more difficult for Putin to even contemplate that. That's why people are saying this is reckless, this is irresponsible. Putin is actually making the world less safe for himself down the line either, but he's thinking short term here. He's thinking, what can I do? What do I actually have? You can also destroy lots of infrastructure as he's doing. You can use subversion. We're worried about all of the undersea cables, all these weird things happening, off Orkney or in the Mediterranean or, all these other things that are happening, Nord Stream 2 pipelines, other infrastructure. There's all kinds of other things that he can do as well here. It's not just, again, there's a civilian nuclear threat of blowing up, one of the reactors. Now, he's got to be sure about where the wind turns and the wind blows. And there's all kinds of things to, factor in here. But Putin is definitely sitting around calculating with other people, what can I do to turn this around? I mean, he still thinks that he can win this. Or, in other words, he can end it on his terms. Crimea, Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, Zaporizhia. And, capitulation. All recognized as being part of Russia. Or he can freeze it and then, kind of figure out where it goes from there, what other pressure he can put on. I mean, I'm sure he's confident he can get rid of Zelensky and he can prevail over us. I mean, look, the UK is going through prime ministers, faster than I'm changing my socks, so it's like, he can, prevail on the, basically he can have an impact on the political scene in Europe and elsewhere. I mean, again, everyone's talking about winter coming, and Putin's thinking, yeah, great, I've destroyed the infrastructure of Ukraine.
Are you worried about the winter?
Well, yeah, but I mean, look, the other thing is that we have to start preparing. I mean, we have to start thinking about this. We've got a wartime economy situation. That's where we are. We've got the home front to think about as well. Putin has declared war on us. He did that on September 30th, and he's done it at other points as well. We've just not paid attention. But he was pretty explicit in September 30th. I mean, go back and watch that speech. And, he is gambling that, people will go back, to basically taking Russian gas and oil, but it's not going to be that simple as well. And then, the question has to be, do we really kind of think he's going to play fair after that when he's kind of also shown that he can leverage that?
It's such a complicated world.
It is complicated. It's very complicated.
And it's never, it feels like things are heating up. And China is very quiet right now.
Because they're watching what happens. I mean, for President Xi, he's trying to consolidate his power even further after the party congress, but he doesn't want to look like he made a mistake by backing Putin. I mean, he thought Putin was also going to be out, and Ukraine would probably be open for massive Chinese investment. China was the largest investor in Ukraine before the war. Largest single investor. I mean, the EU was bigger, of course.